Now, it's a common misconception that you're not legally allowed to give a bad reference. You can give a bad reference as long as it's true. And again, common misconception legally is that backdoor references are themselves illegal. They're not.
What an odd position to think about your entire recruiting team as less important, or your entire recruiting process as less important than one person's external opinion. The reason why I think from a recruiting standpoint that I've always had like a problem with that as well, the way that most companies approach it is like, well, of course they're going to give a positive reference on that person. So how do you actually approach that conversation, I think, is really important. Hopefully any candidate listening to this who's sub-director level, the likelihood is that a backdoor reference check isn't probably happening to you. And what you're going to be asked to provide is... Hello and welcome to another episode of the Open to Work podcast. We come to you live every Monday with top tips from leading HR experts from around the world on exactly how to navigate this job market. This week is an extra special episode. I'm joined by a friend of the podcast, Hamraj Gulamali. Hello, Hamraj, and welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Matt, really glad to be here. How are you doing?
Yeah, doing well. Always fun recording with people who I've actually met in IRL. A lot of my recordings are done digitally with people I've actually never met in person. So this is a nice change.
I didn't even think about that, right? Like that actually most of the time you probably have not actually had a chance to meet these people in real life. Yeah, I didn't really think about that.
Yeah, and we met because you did a really good presentation at an event that I was at, and a lot of those kind of topics we're going to be pulling through today. So stay tuned, listener, because it's going to get philosophical up in here. Okay, well, look, as we start every episode of the Open to Work podcast, Hamraj, tell me about yourself.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Matt. So I was called to the bar back in 2019. So I read law, finished up my master's at UCL, and then was called to the bar back in 2019. I then spent some time working in court. Was like some of the best years of my life. Was exactly what I trained to do. Was exactly what I wanted to do. Try and become a barrister. And then I was living up in the north of England in Manchester, and then COVID struck. And obviously, lots of people have lots of reasons why COVID interrupted or disrupted or changed their life plans. It was half a decade ago now, right? So it's tough to kind of think that was so long ago, right? It's crazy, right? That was half a decade ago. Last weekend just
wow, that is, I had not even thought about that. That is crazy. That's a LinkedIn post right there.
Half a decade is one of those phrases you can use to make things sound like it was really far, like really long time ago. Anyway, basically COVID struck and courts in Manchester and across the North shut, and I was sort of not really sure what to do, facing kind of not having much work on. You're self-employed, so how do you generate income? I basically sort of broke glass in case of emergency and moved back to London and just kind of like hustled my way into a job in a startup. And as their kind of junior opsy legal associate, and I've basically been working my way through startups ever since. I've been at Zinc now for near on 3 years, and I head up their legal and compliance team. It's been a real journey. Kind of founded the team solo. We're now a team of 5. Covers a really huge range from infosec, data security, to regulatory affairs, to straight up commercial law. So yeah, really, really broad range. For those people who don't know, Zinc is a global automated background and reference checking tool. So that's kind of our lean into this kind of HR talent space. We run background checks on behalf of lots of clients. So yeah, that's kind of a little bit about me and what I'm up to at the moment.
Yeah, and super important kind of setup, because background checks and reference checking, all that sort of stuff is the real topic of today. I guess if I think about this from like a candidate experience perspective, 9 times out of 10, you get to the end of an interview process, you're really, really excited, and then all of a sudden you have to fill in a ton of forms, and you ask lots and lots of questions. You're asked to fill in your address history for decades and decades and stuff like that, and you have to find your HR department's phone number of the dog that they once had, and it's like quite in depth. This isn't a pitch, but this sounds like something that Zinc was kind of really founded to change.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's not a pitch, but at the end of the day, what we try and do is take the pain out of background checking. I mean, you've absolutely hit the nail on the head. You've worked in this space for a long time, and I'm sure you've also been on the other side as a candidate yourself, right? Waiting for that job to kind of come through. The intention is to automate as much as possible. Background checking still in 2025 is a really manual process. It's driven by kind of like by paper, basically, by people running around doing really manual, inefficient processes. And it's confusing because a lot of them can be automated.
Mhm.
So what we've built is meant to be a really simple, streamlined, and safe product, right? At the end of the day, if you've got 30, 35 people in a room processing a piece of paper, the likelihood of one of those getting lost or put into the wrong like filing cabinet is really high. If you've got a piece of software trying to do that, it's just much less likely to make a mistake, right? And when you're dealing with people's information, and like you said, like the fact that people want to get these jobs and they want to get working,
Yeah.
being quick and being safe is kind of paramount.
It could also be kind of quite a stressful experience from a candidate's perspective because you don't, it's sort of like going to the doctors, right? Like 9 times out of 10, you don't have anything wrong with you. It's just a sniffle, but then you put the stuff out into the ether and one day you get a little notification saying, oh, something's not kind of come through exactly as the documents lined up and meant to be. And all of a sudden your brain spirals. And it can become like a very stressful experience very quickly. And I've had that happen to me before simply because they ran the wrong check and that stuff didn't exist because they weren't meant to run that check in the first place. And all of a sudden I was on a red flag for my company when I shouldn't have been.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. This is something that we try and remember all the time. And I think from a candidate-centric perspective, it's really important to put yourself in that mindset, right? When something flags up from a recruiter perspective or a background checking provider's perspective, it's just another thing that's flagged up. Whereas for a candidate, like you said, it's that 1 in 10 or sometimes even 1 in 100 example. And little things like running the wrong check, but even just like false positives because you've got a common name, right? So if you've got a common name and your company is doing a financial sanctions check on everyone, let's just say everyone they're employing into their finance department, the likelihood of you getting flagged is actually quite high. False positives occur quite often for like a financial sanctions check. And suddenly you're sat there thinking, have I done that? I'm sure it wasn't me. I'm sure that's never happened. And one of the things we have to talk about a lot is just going down that common sense route. Well, there's this problem that is apparently occurred in South Africa in 2017. Just ask the candidate if they've ever been to South Africa. If they've not been, the likelihood of that being a genuine problem is really low.
Yeah. Okay. And so let's start with like background checks are not a sexy topic to start off with. But the reality is that every single candidate basically in the world is going to get some sort of background check as they go through their recruiting process, especially if you live in a Western country, right? Like if you live in the UK, like most parts of Europe, America, you're getting some sort of background check that's happening before your employment starts. Maybe just kind of run us through like what are the classic background checks that most companies are running around the world nowadays?
Yeah, so right to work is the most obvious, and right to work is the one that I think you would encapsulate like that 99.99% of candidates. That's the reason that pretty much everyone is going to have some experience with this at some point. The next big one are reference checks. So basically verifying that you worked at the place that you said you worked at and that the people who you used to work with can vouch for you. And then I'd say the third kind of biggest one is criminal, right? Just doing a criminal record check. In the US, they will do it for absolutely anyone. If you apply to be like a shelf stacker part-time in your summer holidays from school at Walmart, they will run a criminal background check on you, right? There are countries that are further down the line than that do much less. But yeah, criminal checks is really big. And then like really also like professional qualifications. Like, did you go to the university you said you went to? Did you actually get that qualification, that professional body qualification that you said you've got? So those I think are some of the most classic examples. There are lots of others. But yeah, those are some of the most classic examples.
Yeah. And you mentioned really briefly there reference checks, and then we talked about background checks. And I think it's important to distinguish them slightly as they mean different things and can be run in like very, very different ways. So like from like a legal perspective, what's your how do you differentiate a reference check and a background check?
Yeah, so I think, well, it's legal and conceptual, right? At the end of the day, I would say that a background check typically is associated with your person, right? Do you as a person have a criminal record? Did you as a person go to that university that you said you went to, or do you as a person have the right to work in the United Kingdom? Whereas a reference check typically, although we will, I'm sure, get onto this, typically is about your work persona, your work personality. And that's why it's legally typically falls under the remit of employment law. References, when you're talking about what you can say, what you can't say, etc., typically fall under the remit of employment and HR law. because it's often related to your work persona. So I would say that's the real key distinction.
And then when we like split out reference checks, it's such an interesting category, right? Because they can form many different ways. From like a legal perspective, what is a reference check in the way that like Zinc would define it?
So it's verifying your work history. I think
Yeah.
that is how Zinc would define it. And like you said, there are many different ways of doing that. There are also many different types of references. So you can get a character reference, you can get a professional reference, you can get a personal reference, and you can even get a regulatory reference. So, for example, on the regulatory side, the FCA requires the companies it regulates to undergo certain types of reference checks for certain durations. Right? It's a 5 year, it's a 6 year period that they have to look back on, etc. So there are different types of references, but what Zinc would sort of define it as, and how I try and look at it, is it's basically a verification of your work history.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think reference checks can be cut down into multiple different segments, right? Like the reference checks that you were talking about, which is just a confirmation of work history, to I want to speak to your previous manager at one or more companies, to backdoor reference checks where someone is being asked for an opinion about you without you even being aware that opinion is being asked. I mean, what is the difference from a legal perspective on these three types of reference checks, do you think?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So if we just park backdoor for a second, because that's a kind of in itself its own sort of discussion. Typically, companies will create their own policy around how they give references. So really large organizations will have a standardized format of reference. And as a future employer, all you're really able to do is get what the HR department decides is allowed, right? Some companies will not have set up that kind of internal policy. And bear in mind, this isn't derived from statute. This is company policy that's really hard to penetrate. So we see this all the time where our customers won't bother. They know that certain companies have HR provided references. They're not going to be able to get any further than that, right? But it's company policy, not law. The second level is that kind of we really want to speak to someone and there's no internal company policy. Okay, maybe we can pick up the phone to the provided referee's details, right? The candidate will say, you can speak to this person, this is their email, this is their phone number. You can maybe get on the phone to them, you can maybe have a more informal chat. They might speak to you, they might give you something written, or they might just say, look, they worked here from September 2019 to September 2022, they had this job title, and they didn't have any disciplinaries, right? It just depends on the person. Then you have backdoor references, right? Which is basically using your network as a recruiter to find out if the person you're trying to hire is any good. What are they actually like? And the reason they exist is because of the stuff I've spoken about before, right? Because so many companies have policy around what they can say, and because there is some law around what you can put in a reference. Now, it's a common misconception that you're not legally allowed to give a bad reference. You can give a bad reference as long as it's true, right? But because people believe you're not allowed to give a bad reference legally, that's why this back door has come into play, right? People have started going behind the official curtain and saying to their network, what do you think about this person? And again, common misconception legally is that backdoor references are themselves illegal. They're not, because they would count as a personal reference. So you can ring someone up in your network and say, how was so-and-so in the job? You worked with them for 2 years. What were they like? Just generally, what were they like, right? The issue is that ethically, it's really dubious. A candidate has given you 2 people they want you to speak to, and you're going to a third that you've not been given permission by the candidate to speak to, right? That's where it gets ethically really dubious.
So let's dig into that in a bit more detail. Why do you think it's ethically dubious?
Because at the end of the day, I genuinely believe recruitment processes should be as upfront and as transparent as possible. It's already a difficult enough process, and typically you're talking with someone who either needs a job or wants a new job, right? More often than not, those are the 2 categories, right? It's a stressful time. It's difficult to convince someone in such a short format that you're the right person for the job. If you're then adding this extra layer of dishonesty, basically, I think you're really playing with what is and isn't kind of ethically acceptable. A candidate has said to you, these are the 2 people I want you to speak to. You've turned around and said, thanks, but no thanks. Basically saying, I don't trust your judgment. I want to speak to someone in my network who I trust more than you.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting because I listen to a number of different podcasts in like the recruiting and HR space, and you speak to most executive search leaders, and they're like the backdoor reference is the number one most valuable thing you can do to evaluate hires. There's lots of like writing out there that speaks to this specifically in very well published books as well,
Yeah.
and I've always taken issue with that perspective. One, because it essentially devalues the entire recruiting process. If you're going to put more emphasis on this one person's outside opinion who doesn't know your business, doesn't know your operating procedure, doesn't know the type of company or the type of role they're doing in lots of detail, yet they have more sway over all of the executives or all the people that you've spoken to, then I think that's a very odd position for a business to take, just philosophically. Like, what a waste of time for all of your executives. And this does generally happen at a senior leadership level, but it can happen all the way down. Like, what an odd position to think about your entire recruiting team as less important, or your entire recruiting process as less important than one person's external opinion. I think that's one part of it. And the second part of it is that person may have been really successful or unsuccessful in that particular environment, but as it relates to your environment, it's a completely different size and shape, right? Like, just because you were successful at Zinc doesn't necessarily by default mean you're going to be really successful in another referencing company that's at a completely different size and scale for what you're in. And that one person has a disproportionately large impact on your ability to get that job at that point, which you also have no control over as a candidate.
I think, firstly, yeah, it does happen at a senior level. Let's be open about that, right? Like, there is some. We need to set the scene, right? It doesn't typically happen when you're hiring a junior like ops associate, right? You're just not really going to go to the extent of getting a backdoor reference. It is typically reserved for senior hires, and it is something that especially executive search firms talk a lot about really positively, and lots of executives, like C-suite level executives who were involved in hiring in a big way, also talk about it really positively. Yeah, like you, I completely disagree, and I do think it's like it devalues your entire recruitment process, like you said. So you've basically gone through typically a 4 to 6 stage recruitment process, probably some sort of task, maybe multiple tasks at the executive level, taking months. Yeah, you're saying at the end of that, yeah, we don't really care about any of that. That was all just for show, and we're going to ask this one person who I know what they think about this person just off the cuff. Philosophically, I completely agree with you. What a strange position to adopt, right? Just from a resource allocation perspective, why have the recruitment process at all, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's this other kind of, I suppose, legal constraint that comes in, right? When you talk about fair hiring practice, fair recruitment practice, especially when you're talking about publicly listed companies, right? The obligations that they have to their shareholders and what they have to do, I think, is also one of the reasons why backdoor references remain so popular, because actually they don't want to go through the hiring processes, but they have to. Now, I'm speculating here, right? I'm completely speculating, but it does make, otherwise it doesn't make any sense to create these really extensive hiring processes and then just go through a backdoor reference for someone really senior who you supposedly assessed really thoroughly.
Mm-hmm. But I also think it's like part of executive culture, right? Like, it's you're in the club or you're not in the club, and and like, look at this, like the general look and feel of people who are at this level. Look at the general people who might not get to that level, right, and who are excluded from that. And if we look back at the origins of non-listed roles, a lot of them are like come from your golf course, a lot of them come from the McKinsey club, your graduate club, right? That's where, like, having your mate introduce you to someone, these are all of these things that are like archaic, I think, in the context of recruiting practices, and actually only serve really to bring homogeneity into our leadership teams all around the world. And executives who buy into that and continue to buy into that, I think are buying into a homogenous world of and kind of some bad practices. Look, I think ultimately, the reality is that backdoor reference checks do happen, especially at a leadership stage, and there's not a lot you can do other than have like a fantastic career and never ever make a mistake to avoid it, because there is always going to be a naysayer about your career somewhere out there. But I think that, I think it's important to discuss this sort of stuff philosophically, because I think it happens a lot out there. But I want, hopefully any candidate listening to this who's, is, let's say, sub director level, the likelihood is that a backdoor reference check isn't probably happening to you. And what you're going to be asked to provide is two like 2 references from people who you've previously worked with, and at that point, you're the reason why I think from a recruiting standpoint that I've always had like a problem with that as well, the way that most companies approach it is like, well, of course they're going to give a positive reference on that person. I have heard of circumstances where that hasn't happened, but generally speaking, people give positive references. So how do you actually approach that conversation, I think, is really important. So, for example, I will always decline an executive's like request just to get two reference checks on someone's like, no, why? The reason why, what I'm looking for is because we want to better set them up for success. What sort of environment are they successful in? What's the best way to ramp them up as quickly as possible? What are the learnings that you think they're going to have to go through in the first 6 months that I can better enable them? Those are really powerful questions, I think, when you attach it to reference checks. It's not about their quality. We've assessed them. We know they're good. That's what your recruiting process is for. But this is about setting them up for success. And I think that changes the mindset of what a kind of traditional reference check does in that way.
Yeah, I completely think you're right. I think if you think about the future of reference checks and where they fit in terms of risk mitigation from a background checking perspective and risk mitigation from a recruitment perspective, I think you've really hit the nail on the head there. Like, that's what your recruitment process is for, right? Mm-hmm. Your recruitment process is designed to understand if this person can do the job. And as I see it, your background checking process is designed to understand if this person is a risk to the business. Yeah. Those are the two kind of yin and yang pieces that I kind of see fitting together between kind of people and talent, right? You got to make sure they can do the job, and then you got to double check that they're not going to be a huge risk to the business because of something in their past or something in their present, more relevantly. Where does a reference check, like a traditional reference check, really fit into solving that puzzle? If I'm being really honest, as someone working in this space right now, I don't see that the traditional reference check has a future. I would be surprised if in 5-10 years people are undergoing then that like you said, that kind of, please just get me 2 people from their company who they used to work for. What's the point? What are you asking for? Right? Yeah. What is that doing for you as a risk mitigation exercise? Oh, well, I didn't even ring them. Most people don't. Like, that's the other thing. When you go through that process, that basic process of please get me 2 email addresses, often the person asking for them doesn't even check up. It's just a file keeping exercise, right? Yeah. So at that point, you're not doing any risk mitigation. So there's no point in doing that kind of type of traditional reference check.
The reason why I think backdoor reference checks and reference checking at like these leadership perspective does play such a strong hold, does have such a strong hold in our processes still, is actually, I think, that most companies don't trust their recruiting process at the end of the day. And I think that is like the real core that sits behind a lot of the ways why this is such an integral part of processes still. Because most executives, when they really push comes to shove, they don't actually trust their leaders, and they trust other people who they know outside of work, potentially even more. And that's a problem, I think, that the companies need to really address. The why. Why do you think you need to take that backdoor reference check? What is it that you've not uncovered in your recruiting process that you're going to uncover in that backdoor reference check, and really challenge yourself, to do that. And I've been asked to do backdoor reference checks for people before, and I've refused. But I've also had situations where candidates, and I'm not saying this is happening at Muse, but I've had situations where candidates have been doing really, really well, nailed the process, and then a backdoor reference check's popped up and it's completely thrown the entire process out of whack. And all of a sudden we've got a huge issue that we need to uncover and pick apart within the recruiting organization. And so it can really throw processes off when that happens.
But like you said, that shouldn't be happening if the ultimate decision maker has faith in their recruitment process. So where you've got a hiring manager or decision maker, maybe multiple hiring managers, multiple decision makers that don't believe in the process that they're not involved in, then obviously a backdoor reference can throw a spanner in the works. Whereas if you've got a robust decision maker, robust hiring manager who turns around and says, yeah, look, I mean, I spoke to one of my friends and they didn't really rate them from their last company, but do you know what? I trust you. I trust my team. It's not going to matter, because you should be able to do all the things you were talking about earlier, which is contextualize, right? Maybe they were really good at that job, or maybe they were really bad at that specific job, right? But we have created a different system. We know what our hiring needs are, and we know that this person has the skills to fill them. And that's where I always come back to this idea of risk mitigation. If you're hiring a truck driver, this is the example we always talk about. If you're hiring a truck driver, is it good risk mitigation practice to check that they've not been disqualified for drunk driving or dangerous driving? Yeah, that's how a proper background check works, as a toolbox, as part of the toolbox in a successful kind of people and talent function, right? A successful HR function. You can do that when you're hiring that role. what does the backdoor reference achieve other than, like you said, A, show that you don't believe in your hiring team, and B, give you information that isn't actually relevant to either the job they're doing or the risk you're trying to mitigate against.
Oddison James are one of the leading people and talent agencies. Since 2013, they've been responsible for over 1,000 people and talent hires, including one in a company that I used to work at. They helped me hire my head of technology TA. So I know the guys there pretty well. They've been responsible for scaling some of the most innovative companies in the UK and the EU. Also recently just launched in the US. So even folks in your neck of the woods now, James, can get involved for contingent, retained, and executive search. And they also now do embedded through AJX. So they can do it all.
Let's move on, because you dropped a little nugget there about like the future of referencing, and I'd love to talk about future of background checks, and where you think the future of background checks is going.
So I think it's more in all senses. Firstly, more regulation, right? So right now you've got the FCA, CQC, Ofsted, etc., that have rules around how you have to check, how you have to run background checks on the companies they regulate. Yeah, you have some regulators that are silent, and you have no generic kind of rules around what you have to do. Well, actually, that's untrue. You've got generic rules around DBS, enhanced DBS, and then outside of that criminal check space in the UK, you have no generic rules, right? We'll see that fill in. We'll see other regulators take more stances, and we won't see the generic rule, I think, for a while, but we will start to see that space fill in. Yeah, I think we will also just see companies adopt it on the other side. I think companies will start to push. So I don't think it's a push-pull relationship. I think it's a push-push relationship. From one side, you're going to get regulators and lawmakers pushing. And from the other side, I actually think you're going to get companies pushing. I think they're going to meet really nicely in the middle. And it's just going to be more. Because there's just more pressure to get things right at the moment, yeah? So, and I don't think that's going away. So when you bring someone who is a bad hire into the business, people are always looking for something they can blame. They're always looking for something they can use as a get out of jail free card. So if there's a problem where it turns out that maybe they had a criminal record, or maybe there was something really problematic on their social media, and you didn't find that out, there you go, you're the scapegoat. And so people will want to mitigate against that. You want to turn around as an HR talent partner and say, well, we ran this whole suite of background checks on them. We did this whole interview process on them. There's nothing to indicate that they would have been a rogue actor. They've come on board and done this off their own volition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you're talking about, again, risk mitigation, trying to make sure that every single stone is unturned so that when you make that hire, you're confident that they're going to be as impactful as possible. And we're not talking about quality of hire here. We're talking about things going wrong, like fundamental things going wrong. And so you mentioned briefly social media. What role will social media play in reference and background checking?
Well, I look at it from a perspective of, if you're not doing it now, you will be in 10 years, or well, in 5 years, really, because it's just where so much information lives now. It is one of the most reliable, permanently documented spaces out there. And yeah, like people can go through huge manual processes of deleting photos and untagging themselves, etc. But the reality is that most people don't, because most people are sort of sat there thinking, yeah, well, it's okay. Like I've got a few pictures of me on a night out, and I've got, most people just don't do that. But I think from a company perspective, you're going to sort of need to check that as the online, offline world continues to bleed into itself. You have this online documentation, right? So you have to check that.
So what are people going to be looking for in social media background checks?
I think they'll be looking for any obvious red flags. So for example, any illegal behavior becomes like quite simple for a company to build a policy around. Mm-hmm. I think the bit that becomes really tricky is that kind of middle ground, right? Offensive behavior that isn't necessarily illegal or against a protected characteristic, but people would deem to be sort of generally offensive. One of the things that we have like flagged, unfortunately, quite regularly on social media when our customers at Zinc start doing these checks is they realize that they've employed people who are genuine neo-Nazis, right? They're not just sort of liking posts. They have pictures of them at far right, alt-right marches. They've got pictures of them with like swastika tattoos, etc. They themselves are actual neo-Nazis. You can't find that anywhere because if they've not been criminal, if they don't have a criminal record for that behavior, then you won't know. The only place you would find that is social media. That's an easy red flag. Yeah, that's an easy red flag. The gray area, right, is okay. Well, someone else has posted something that is really racist. Yeah, and one of your colleagues has commented, being like, do you know what? I agree. They haven't made that racist post, right? They haven't used that hateful language. They haven't done anything illegal, but they are associating themselves with those views. At the end of the day, that person could have grown out of those views. That person could have agreed in a fit of sort of confusion. They might have been annoyed, upset by something. It doesn't mean their behavior is permanently like that. I don't think you should be agreeing with racist posts. The point I'm making is there are so many arguments in the alternative as to why that is not necessarily an immediate red flag. And it's something that companies struggle with day in, day out. How do we classify that association, right? Someone said, I agree, when they were 16. They're 26 now. We're hiring them when they're 26, not 16.
It sort of and also kind of the bars of what's culturally acceptable to put on social media has changed over time. So, what is what I would have posted on Facebook when I was 16 is completely different to my worldview back then. Like, I wouldn't be proud of many of the things that I posted on Facebook back when I was 16. But so do you think that companies will move towards a world where companies like take that stuff into account? Like, how are companies going to engage with this sort of information in a meaningful way that's not, again, like putting them at risk or like kind of discriminating against someone because they have either, right or left-wing views that don't necessarily align with the company?
You can look at existing legal structures. So, for example, most criminal records in the US, the biggest criminal record checking space in the world, they can only go back 7 years legally. You're not allowed to go back further than 7 years in most states because it's deemed like irrelevant. Yeah. And I think you'll see companies borrowing similar frameworks. They will time limit activity and they will say anything prior to 2018, for example, if you did a check in March 2025, you would say anything from March 2018, anything before that, don't search for. You can set those search parameters and you can just exclude it, right? I think you have to start looking at time sensitivity, and it's arbitrary, right? It is arbitrary because some people hold views for their entire lives. Some people hold views for a really short period of time. And also, like, a viewpoint that's really detrimental to the business could have developed in those 7 years. It is an arbitrary time frame, but I think you're going to see companies borrowing similar legal frameworks.
Yeah, I can see, if you are a publicly listed business and you have a senior member of your staff who has like extreme views and is comfortable expressing those extreme views online, like that could be like a legitimate risk to your stock price potentially, especially if that bleeds, or like how does this bleed into like their relationship with some of their employees? I think this is where this starts to become a bit of like a super interesting gray area, right? Just because if I want to work for Twitter and Elon Musk, but I'm like have been like outwardly anti Elon Musk on my Twitter feed, then or X or whatever the hell we call it nowadays. But like that could influence their like very legitimately should influence whether or not they want to hire me because I've been slagging off Elon Musk on my LinkedIn.
100%. I mean, you talk about publicly listed companies. So people in general, ironically, because of the rise of social media, are finding it increasingly difficult to separate the actions of an employee, especially super senior employees, from the actions of their company, right?
I guess it all comes down to exposure when you talk about risk. Like, how exposed would this person's views, if they were to come out, but be like to the like kind of share price or the capability of your company to operate, and then also how much risk would it bring to your employee base as well if that person had those views and like had been like outwardly like negatively talking about women online or something like that. Like that obviously poses a sexual harassment risk within your own business. Like these. Yeah, you can see like the mode of travel, especially in kind of the current environment, that this is on the horizon. It seems quite clear almost that we're going to get to this mode of regulation, especially for senior leaders.
But let's go just to that point that you touched on because it's a really nice point, right? Leave share price alone. You're talking about kind of the employee sentiment, right? Your employer value prop to your employees. If you're openly okay with employing someone who, for example, is constantly posting misogynistic content, not just associating with it, constantly themselves posting misogynistic content online.
Mhm.
Yes, there's that. We can talk about risk, and lawyers love to talk about risk. We talk about risk mitigation. There's a sexual harassment risk in your business that increases, ostensibly. But forget all of that. What does it say about you as an employer that you're willing to do that? Yeah, are we not? Do we not want to work for companies that don't tolerate that full stop? Not because it's like a mitigator of risk, but because we don't want people who are misogynistic working. Like, we don't want to work with people who are misogynistic, right? We don't want to tolerate that behavior in society. And I think that push is the regulator's push, right? And where I think companies will come to meet them is on this basis of a kind of more moral duty, right? The regulator is going to push and say, look, we need to ensure this kind of misogynistic behavior isn't part of our society. But I think companies will come to meet them by saying, yeah, we actually want to live in that society as well. I mean, it's a slightly utopian view, but I do think it also benefits companies based on the kind of more bottom line reasons we were talking about just a few minutes ago.
We are so excited to be sponsored by HireGuide. HireGuide is an end-to-end interview decision platform that makes hiring decisions faster, fairer, and twice as predictive of on-the-job employee performance. As a recruiting leader, I've been looking for a tool that can help me run better interviews across my organization at scale to make better hiring decisions. So when I found HireGuide, I felt all my hopes had been answered. They use cutting-edge AI and behavioral science to enable you to operationalize structured interviews and skills-based hiring that can help you find those star candidates. Hiring a dream team is no easy task, but with HireGuide, it can be.
What do I do as a candidate to engage with this like future world of background checks? Do I go and like clean my social media, or like what do I do?
Yeah, it sounds quite dystopian, to be perfectly honest, but I think you do have to be pragmatic and understand the world as it is, not necessarily the world you want it to be in. This constant kind of online availability means that what we post on social media bleeds into the way we're perceived professionally, right? And that might not be the way you want to.
Even if you've actively separated it as well. I think that's like kind of an important thing. Like my LinkedIn persona is inherently linked to my business and work persona. That's like part of what the brand that I've actively curated. But what isn't is my Instagram and Facebook, and there'll be some like more like real versions of me out there. Hopefully not super accessible, but someone will probably tell me. But like, that's the thing that people want to hear, like that these sorts of checks will go into. Like if you're racist on LinkedIn, you're an idiot. Because it's so traceable. But it's these personal areas, these personal spaces that is more of interest, I think, to businesses.
Oh, that's where all the interest is. That's where 99% of the interest is. No one's really that interested in your LinkedIn because, like you said, if you're being if you're
you're not a full-on idiot.
I mean, basically, you won't pass the idiot test, and you're probably not going to get the job anyway. It's that Twitter, X, Instagram, TikTok space, right? If that's where you're kind of behaving in this really interesting, in this kind of really xenophobic manner, that's where companies are looking for the evidence, right? And to prepare, I do think you have to, like you said, it's just, you have to go away and make sure that you're being clean online, make sure that you've got practicing good kind of social media hygiene, I suppose. That sounds like such a dystopian sort of phrase, but at the end of the day, that is the future direction of travel.
One last question on this topic before I get into our close. How do you think about this from like a video perspective, right? In TikTok, because it's so much harder to analyze video content. Like me posting a video on LinkedIn is harder for you to analyze as like a background check, presumably, than a piece of written content.
Yeah, I think that eventually, I don't want to get too technical, but I would say that I wouldn't hide behind the idea that, well, we can post anything we want in video format because currently it's harder to analyze. Firstly, at the end of the day, the manual check, if you're talking about a senior leadership hire, there's probably a low number of candidates, low volume. The manual check doesn't go anywhere, and the interpretation of the video is really easy, right? Because you can just sit there and watch it as a recruiter. So there's that side which never goes anywhere. But I would always kind of back the tech to catch up eventually. Like I don't see a world in which the tech doesn't catch up and figure out how to reliably go through that kind of that data source and feed it back to the recruiter.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, you can't hide, but you won't be able to hide behind video for too much longer. We'll talk about the future. Let's bring back to today. What do I need to do to effectively prepare myself for a background check in today's land, not in future land?
Yeah, I think make sure your records are in order. Understand. I do think it's important also to understand why. Right, there is an element where candidates should also think and ask their companies, why do you need this information? Why do you need that data on me? But yeah, make sure that your records are in good order. Hope that you're working with a company that uses an online provider, not just Zinc. There's lots of other good online providers out there that automate this process. And yeah, just kind of make sure that you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's. Make sure that there's no obvious issues. I'm not talking about gaps in CVs, right? Because that's another problematic issue. I mean, there's no other issues, and if there are issues, be forward facing.
Yes.
Success that I see most from candidates is when they come to us and say, look, my employer is going to find something when they do this criminal background check. What do you think I should do?
Yeah.
Obviously, we can't advise these candidates, but more often than not, the point we're making to them is, well, if you tell your employer, it's probably, it could go really badly. The offer could be rescinded, but it's more likely than not that they'll be able to have a conversation with you. And that's where we see success, right? It's be forward facing, because if something comes out and you lied about it, then you're definitely getting your offer rescinded. Whereas if you're forward facing, there's a chance you keep that offer.
Yeah, and for reference, like I have been through that with a candidate where they knew that something was going to come up on their background check, and they addressed this with me before I took it to the head of the business where it was relevant, and they said they went through the details of the reference check when it came through and was like, we're comfortable absorbing this level of risk based on what the person does in this business. And I think that is exactly how that sort of stuff should play out. But the reality is that that's the conversation that's going to be happening behind the scenes. Hopefully it won't be like arbitrary no. And the reality is that the bigger you get, the more arbitrary those decisions could be.
It is a shame that unfortunately, the bigger you get, the more layers of control that the business you're applying to has, the more likely it is that there's an arbitrary no, we're not taking that risk. But that being said, like you just used a very common sense example, and they do exist across the working world, where people are able to analyze and say, yeah, okay, that person has a dangerous driving offence, but they're being employed as a financial controller in this business. Like, it's okay. They're not driving any cars on company time ever. Yeah. We can absorb that level of risk as a business.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. That's really interesting. I won't be running away to immediately scrub my social media. I've got nothing to hide, and the person who I am now is very different from the person who I was at 16. But it's been a really interesting kind of discussion, and I think important to kind of get into like why these background checks exist, like what the differences are between these different types of checks as well, the legalities and understanding like your kind of what your rights are, I think, as well as a prospective employee going through a background check, and then the different ways to kind of navigate it. It's super interesting.
Yeah, no, I agree. Thank you so much for having me. It's been great to talk about this. I think it's a constantly evolving landscape.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's frustrating as a candidate is that you often feel excluded from the process, right? So that was also I would always try and push candidates to ask that question. What's this for? What's it about? It's not a negative question. It's just it's a genuine, what are we doing here? What's this for? Get involved, because then you're not in the dark.
My most frustrating one, just for reference, when I went through my most recent background checks, was your home address check. Like, I've moved quite a bit over the last few years, and I've also moved internationally, and holy moly, like going through all of your like homes that you've lived in, getting all of the addresses, like what's the postcode of that place that I lived in Australia for before I moved to the UK, and blah blah. Like, that was such an absolute pain. But then also getting my like university certificate out, like university like degree checks. I don't believe in having a degree is at all relevant for your job whatsoever. I think it's like an interesting from like an integrity perspective, because I have called people who have lied about their degree, and I can understand if the professional qualification degree is directly relevant to your job, why you would need that. But having it as like a blanket, it's just like seems super annoying to me. And I had to go and like call my mum, who like had it in a folder somewhere, and she had to like send me a picture. I was like, come on.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't want to plug Zinc, but we avoid all those problems for our candidates because we just verify directly with the Education Institute, and we also verify directly with local records to check your address history. So both of the things you've just talked about wouldn't have happened if you'd gone through Zinc. But that's the last I'll say on the business.
Well, that's a nice way to close. And Hamraj, where can people find you if they want to hear more about this, about whether or not they're going to get stalked online?
Yeah, I work at Zinc, so Hamraj Gunamali Zinc. You can find me on LinkedIn. I don't actually have Instagram or Twitter or anything like that, so LinkedIn's the only space. But I'm always up for kind of chatting about these things.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. And to our regular listeners, obviously, we'll be dropping more information about background checks in our newsletter on Friday. So check it out on open2worktoolkit.com and subscribe to the newsletter to get tips every Friday into your inbox. And we'll definitely include some of this kind of discussion around social media background checks in that as well. Okay, Hamaj, thanks so much for coming on and look forward to seeing you on the circuit soon.
Thanks a lot, Matt. Thanks so much for having me.